Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hire Me Live. It's Friday. It's fun with Heather and Chris.
It is Fun Friday.
It's Fun Friday. Welcome in. If you are new here, if you're watching the replay, hi. For those that maybe are watching live on LinkedIn or YouTube, please say hello in the chat to us. My name is Heather Balcerek. I am one of the co-hosts of the Hire Me podcast, and I'm here with Chris Lynn, who I will hand this over to in just a moment. But it's my day to introduce the podcast. So I get to try to do this as well as Chris does. So if you haven't heard of Hire Me, we are a podcast that elevates today's top talent by interviewing people who are looking for their next role. And we give you 6 or 7 questions that we interview you. It's very low pressure. It is very easy, about 15-20 minutes. We record it for you. We put it up on audio and video so that you can share it out. So if you would like to book with us, we do have Calendly calendars that you can put some time on. I am in the Eastern Standard Time, and Chris is in Pacific Standard Time on the. I really should write this down. Hi, Jonathan. But yes, that's what we do. We do it for free because we want to help elevate today's top talents. Chris and I have both gone through layoffs in the past year and have since found new roles, and we just want to help pay this forward and help other people find their next role. So, Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. What is going on, everyone? I'm Chris. Again, one of the co-hosts for the Hire Me podcast. And yes, we're excited to do these live shows because it lets Heather and I, just get together, be silly and frivolous on Fridays and have some fun, but be really engaged with all of you live and talk about relevant topics to job seekers. This week we're going to talk about one specific topic, but then like next week, for example, we're going to bring on a guest who is in talent acquisition, and they will talk about what is on their mind. So next week we have Bridget Corden. She is going to come in and talk about how to job hunt with intention. But again, if you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, whatever ideas, feel free engage. Let us know in the chat because we want to make this useful for you. Because today we are going to talk about what questions you ask in an interview. So as a candidate, what questions do you ask? So Heather, I don't know if you have any thoughts on, by the way, we have like no pre-production meetings or anything. So this is literally like live riffing.
Yep.
Do you have any, do you know why it's important to ask questions as a candidate? Like what the significance of that is? I have my own ideas, so I was just curious, like if you have any ideas.
Yes, and I'll say that like my answer to this question probably has evolved throughout my career. Right? Early career, my questions were typically like, how much vacation do I get? What do I have to wear? What time do I need to be here? Like, how does the schedule work? When do I get paid? Like those kind of just basic things, not really caring much about the culture or the job itself. But, now, evolved now into, where I am now in my career. And my questions are definitely a lot different. And some of it's from like experiences at previous jobs. I want to know about the culture. I want to know about, how leadership supports what we do in talent development. I want to know about the team and their values and how they implement those things. Am I going to be a good fit there? So that's where I am today because that is what's important to me. When I'm interviewing with like a hiring manager or somebody that would be my peer. So not necessarily the recruiter, but like the team that I would be on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that asking questions, not only, level one, to your point early in your career, it's like just to understand like what might draw me into this role, right? But then that second layer is like, okay, well, how will collaboration culture actually look? Is this a values fit? Is this a culture fit for me, not for them, by the way? Is this something that will help propel my goals, whether it's career goals, life goals, whatever it might be? I think a third layer to that is these questions that you ask actually help you stand out and make you a stronger candidate. And what I mean by, and we'll provide some of these examples. Um, but again, if you're in the chat, feel free ask your questions on like, hey, is this a good question to ask? Or like, what do you think about these questions? I've read these articles or these approaches. Feel free to ask those. We'll answer them as best we can. Again, we're not recruiters, so we don't act, we know from like our own lenses as hiring managers. But again, that third deeper layer is asking questions can help you stand out because it allows you to create conversation and then solve a problem based on the question that you asked.
That is such a very that is such a valid point, Chris, and I'm glad that you talked about, like, that level 3. What are some of the what are some of the questions that you ask that you feel like make you stand out as a candidate?
Yeah, totally. So one of the questions I ask and almost every that I have asked in the past for every round, no matter who it is what is something on my resume or based on the conversations that we had so far that might give you pause or concern with me being successful in this role or prevent me from moving forward. And this allows the whoever's interviewing you to say, "Hey, I'm not too sure about, this, or I'm not too sure about this." Like what one thing, a couple questions that I've received over the last few years is because I've unfortunately been affected by numerous layoffs over the last few years. They're like, "You've bounced around a lot. Can I'm a little concerned about that." And that gave me the opportunity to say, "Hey, I was affected by pandemic layoffs, one after the other." Right? Rather than them making the assumption like, "Oh, he's hopping," right? It's, "Hey, this is why it looks like I'm job hopping," right? So you can address any questions that they might have in their brains. Another one that I like to ask is, "Hey, what is a current issue that the hiring manager or the hiring team is dealing with that they find is like that's not in the job description right now?" Right? What is one of the what are what's one of the biggest challenges that they're dealing with? Then they can say, "Hey, we're dealing with this issue around, you know, we're dealing with silos right now, or we're dealing with not really being able to push projects through all the way to completion," or whatever their answer might be. Then that gives you an additional piece of information to say, "Hey, this is how I have addressed that issue in the past." Right? This is how I've been able to overcome this or been able to deal with this. And that again, you're almost feeding yourself a question to allow yourself to stand out and address whatever is on their minds.
I like that. I like that you're basically getting them to ask you another question so that you
Yep.
can again show your ability and skill, as it matches up. I remember when I was going through this most recent job search and just kind of prepping for interviews, I talked to one of my previous managers and was kind of walking through like, here are the questions that I plan to ask, and she told me, she said, "Hey, add this to your list." And I was like, "Oh, this is a genius answer or question. Sorry, it's a genius question." And it was, "If I were to get this role, what could I do to make your job easier?" And I think, you could I asked this question in the interview where I was not interviewing with the hiring manager, but I was actually interviewing with somebody that's on like an adjacent team. So we don't work side by side, but we're on adjacent teams, and a VP. And so my service to them is going to look different. And they both gave me such good answers that have helped me, like, it helped me go into the presentation round and make a presentation that, actually spoke to some of the things they talked about. Um, and I think that's one of those things that if you, sorry, I'm going to go on just a little bit of a of a thing. When you're asking these questions, by the way, make sure you're writing down what they say, because then if you have multiple interviews, you can start to pull that information. You can say, "Oh yeah, when I interviewed with so and so, they mentioned this and this is blah," and you get to make this kind of connection or this kind of golden thread through all of your interviews
Yeah.
that shows that you're paying attention, that you're invested, you're interested. It just, like you said, Chris, right? Like the questions can set you apart. So using those to fuel other answers helps you continue to do that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the questions are it goes so far beyond just like, hey, how do you all work? How did these really should be things to answer some questions that you might have internally that might address some like culture or values things to make sure that it's a good fit for you, that this is the right step for you as a candidate, if you were to get a job offer. Um, like again, I've gone into organizations, or I've interviewed with organizations when I've said, "Hey, you know what? There's actually some tension here that I don't want to be a part of." Like there are some like, as I had conversations, so what some of these questions to like source these tensions were like, "Hey, being in learning and development, being in talent development, how do we work across as a partner with other parts of the business?" And based on the answers that I received, I could tell that either, these teams were siloed or the goals of the role were so narrow that they would be derailed by someone else's agenda. And so I would be able to say, okay, hey, that's not really something I look to be a part of. I have one organization in mind. I got an offer from this organization and then it was rescinded. And then 2 months later, the hiring manager came back and said, it's a good thing we didn't hire you because we all just got laid off. So, like, it's, and it was because of some of those tensions. So it's, we talked about red flags a few episodes ago. This will help you source some of those red flags. What are some of the red flags that you've experienced before and have seen? Pull some questions from your experience to say, hey, I did not like these experiences in the past. How might that crop up here in this role or on this or in this organization? Chris, good to see you. Chris Miller, good to have you. Jonathan, I know you're still in the chat and you've got a question, so we'll definitely address that in a little bit. But again, if you're joining us live right now, feel free to drop your questions or thoughts into the chat. We're talking about what questions to ask in interviews. So Heather,
Yeah.
what you sent me an article or a post
Yeah.
earlier this week of someone who said, you know what, these are some great questions to ask in an interview. So what are those 5 questions, or whose post was it and what are those questions?
Yeah, so it's Brian Creeley. It's he runs a lifeafterlayoff.com. I would definitely say I learned a ton from him in my layoff journey and finding a new job. So I definitely recommend him as somebody to follow. It's BRYANCREELY, or just a lifeafterlayoff.com is his website. But his 5 questions to ask during your interview. The first one is, why is this position open? Which is a great question. I asked this one in my recent interviews, um, because it was a new position. So like, well, why is it open? And that's how I found out a little bit more about the backstory of what was going on. What's your vision for this role? This is absolutely a great question for the hiring manager, because then you can, and he says in here, right, this will help you assess if their long-term goal for this role fits with your career as well, which I think is great, especially if you're looking to find somewhere where you can move up. 3, how do you plan to measure success? And thinking about this through the lens of L&D is so critical because it can be very difficult to measure success
Yes.
of training. And so
Yes.
knowing how do they do that now? Like what do they measure against? Or like, oh, well, attendance is or an NPS. Well, is there anything else that we look at? Like growth, promotion, like what's what else are
Yep.
we looking for? And then you can again get that insight of kind of where are they in their maturity of their program as well. um,
Yeah.
the fourth one, how many people in the department have been promoted in the past 3 years? And in his little thing here, it says instead of asking about career growth, a better indicator would be the hiring manager's track record of developing their team. This one is one I think it's a good question, but you have to pose it to the right people because, like the role I'm in, they're a brand new team. This question would have gotten me nothing.
Yeah.
So it's understanding who you're talking to is that question actually going to be impactful?
And on sorry, real quick on that, I think it's important, like as a precursor, is like, to understand in your case, right, Heather, like what's going on with this team, what's the history of this team, and that's a question to ask in and of itself. It's like, hey, how has this team operated in the past? What have they done? You know, and that will give you some context into what questions to ask next, like promotions in the past. So just wanted to call that out.
I like that. Thank you. And then the last one he says is what is your leadership style? So absolutely the hiring manager, if this is the person you're going to work for, ask that question. Um, there's a question if you do a hire me interview, we ask you answer the questions, what kind of culture and leadership are you looking for? So know that going into any interviews. That is so critical. And so when you're interviewing with the hiring manager, if they have not asked you that question, because I was asked that question and I asked that question as a hiring manager, if you don't get that question, ask that question because you don't want to step into someone's leadership style that maybe doesn't jive with yours,
Yeah.
with what you're looking for. And that could be a really uncomfortable situation. It could end up to a short tenure there. You'd be unhappy. Like you need to know.
Yeah. You definitely need to know. I would also, if you're talking with the hiring manager and asking about leadership style, again, going back to some of your own red flags or the things that have tested your boundaries in the past, ask them those more pointed questions, right? Like, I'm pulling this out of a hat, but like, how have you handled when one of your employees had a conflict with someone else on the other team, right? How have you managed that, or how have you led them through that? Um, Asking some of those kind of questions where it's like, hey, I've dealt with this in the past. I didn't like how my previous boss handled it. How would you handle it? Right. This will help source that leadership style. Leadership style in general, I feel, is just kind of very broad and it encompasses so many things. I think everyone is always, almost any leader is going to say, I'm a good communicator, I'm a good collaborator, like all those things. So like kind of like dig at that a little bit more by asking some of those more pointed questions on like things that may have tested your boundaries before. So
Yeah.
just saying.
And if they give you a general answer like that, do not be scared to ask more questions, just like they do of you when you're giving
Mhm.
answers and they say, hey, I'm here at this level. I want to go a level deeper. I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Ask a follow-up question. So, okay, you said you coach your people. What does that look like? Kind of, do you have a cadence? Do you have a format? Like, what would it be like to be in a coaching session with you?
Yeah.
Um, One of the people I interviewed recently they asked me, how do I develop my team professionally? Like, what do I do for the individual? And that's a fantastic question. If you're looking for an organization if you're looking for something that is, going to give back to you and build you and help you grow, that's a fantastic question to ask if that's important to you, which hopefully it
Yeah.
is. But it's a great question to ask. So, all right. So Chris, do you want to get to Jonathan's question?
Yeah, let's get to this question. This is a great, great question. So, Jonathan asked in the chat, and again, if you are watching this live, feel free to put them in here. And if you're watching this afterwards, put your questions in anyway, and maybe we can get to it or other people can address it as well. But Jonathan asks, I recently asked, what is your company doing to create more opportunities for underrepresented communities? Is this a good question to ask? Um, as someone who practices in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, I think this is a great question to ask. Personally, I would frame it a little bit differently, because ultimately, what you're and Jonathan, if you're still on, like, feel free to correct me in the chat. But I think ultimately, what you're looking for is how is the organization and this hiring manager working to be more equitable, and how are they looking to rectify any injustices that may be happening within the organization or within the communities in which they operate, right? So those are the kind of the two questions. So um, I think the way I would phrase this would be, what has, instead of talking about the what, I would look for the results. So, just like how hiring managers are always looking for the results and the actions and things that have been done, right? Let that be your guiding point. So, you know, does the organization even have a DEIB program or a justice program, or a JEDI program, right? So that's one. And two is, when did it start? How are you measuring it? And B, how are you doing now as an organization? And C, what are you personally doing to progress the needs of underrepresented or marginalized communities? So that's how I would rephrase those. So it's a bit more pointed, and it can actually show you whether or not they've moved the needle. Um, yeah. So that's where I'd start.
I
Great
can't give
question.
I I I can't even add anything to that. That's yes. See Chris's answer. But you know what? I will say this, Jonathan, like asking that type of question, I think is necessary. Like it's a needed, it's necessary for that to start being part more of more of the conversation when you're interviewing for companies. And I think maybe people would be scared to ask it, or you know, where can they like maybe find that information, or you know, they might not know how to approach it. So I appreciate you bringing that question up, because
Yeah.
Chris gave us such a good way to frame it in a couple of different ways.
Yeah.
So
I would also say, don't be afraid to ask tougher questions of hiring managers, because their response will tell you more about their leadership style than if you just ask about their leadership style. So, Jonathan, I'm going to use your question as an example is, hey, how have you, as you're looking at like diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, ask the hiring manager, what have you learned about yourself in your organization's DEI journey? And where have you found that you needed to improve? And what have you done since then to improve? Like, that's a really tough question. And there are going to be some organizations, I would say a lot of organizations and hiring managers that say, oh, I've taken all these courses, I've done all these things, but they're very fluffy. They don't actually show any actual, like, humble, self aware, self reflective growth for themselves. So don't be afraid to ask those questions, because if they are not willing as a leader to, and this is personal philosophy, if they're not willing to be humble to show that they have their own growth to do, they might be a toxic leader. Just saying.
that's good. That's good,
I
Chris.
need to write
Like
it down. That's a tweet.
you're on
That's a
fire
tweet.
today. Like, man. One of the things I think about too, in thinking about asking hard questions in an interview is, you know, I mean, I was looking back at like my job interest spreadsheet where that was the end all be all of everything job search. And I have a tab that's interview questions, like what things I want to ask. And it's a very long list that I could pull from. But thinking about it in like, Brian's 5 questions to ask, that kind of thing. Don't ask these questions just because somebody says it's a good question. Make sure that the question is important to you. That is very key, to making sure you also get what you want out of the question. Um, is, a question like, I can't even think of one off the top of my head, but, oh, hold on, there was one I did just see one. Um, there's a question on this list, like, which of my decisions would require approval and who would approve? Like, that's not a question, that doesn't mean anything to me. I don't
Yeah.
have the job, I don't have enough context to ask that question,
Yeah.
but there would be other positions where that might be a very applicable question, but
Yeah.
it's not to me. So don't
Eh,
just ask them to ask them.
yeah. And I'm thinking that question is like for someone who's coming from an environment of micromanaging and who wants to move in, who needs or wants more autonomy for their own work, like that might be a really relevant question, right? I've been very lucky in like my career where like I've only had like maybe one or two bosses that were micromanagers. The rest have really let me be autonomous. So that question doesn't really apply to me personally, but again, great question. Heather, we are coming up on time, so let's close
No,
this thing out. So
so
thank you
fast.
all again for watching the Hire Me podcast live. We do this every Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Um, Again, you can find us everywhere you get your podcasts. If you're listening to this, or if you are watching live or watching the replay, we are on YouTube and LinkedIn. If you or you know someone who is job hunting and they are struggling to stand out and they want to elevate themselves, make sure you send them this link. This is our Calendly link. Again, Heather is on the East Coast. I am on the West Coast for time's sake. So get them signed up. I just interviewed two amazing people this week. Jonathan, who's in the chat right now, I interviewed him. His is going to go up later next week. But yeah, we are doing this for free. It's a 15-minute process where we just ask you some questions. We create a video resume for you and we will upload it for you and you can share it with whoever you like. Make sure you give us a subscribe and follow wherever you are at so we can continue elevating all of today's top talents. And again, one more thing next week. Make sure you join us next week where we are joined by Bridget Corridon, who is going to talk about job hunting with intention. Okay, that was a mouthful. Heather, any final thoughts or last words
And it
before
was
we
so
sign off for the day?
smooth. It was so smooth, Chris. You do it so well. Like, so, no, just, everybody, if you have a topic you would like for us to talk about, if you know somebody that you think would be great on the show, if you think you would be great on the show and would like to, participate, please send us a message. We would love to, have the opportunity to meet you, to, get your, get what your information that's in here out there,
Yep.
to people. It's Friday. I have 0 words left. 0 words. But we appreciate all of you, everybody that's been on the podcast. I interviewed John. I just said Jonathan because you said Jonathan, and I'm reading the chat. Chris Seidemann. I interviewed him this week, and it went up a couple days ago. So go check it out, make some new connections, share their profiles and their stuff on LinkedIn, get their name out there. We and they greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks all.